social progress, destroying society, sowing the seeds of anarchy." "But the wars," Conger said. "About them." "The wars? Well, there were no more wars. It must be acknowledged that the elimination of war was the direct result of nonviolence practiced on a general scale. But we can take a more objective view of war today. What was so terrible about it? War had a profound selective value, perfectly in accord with the teachings of Darwin and Mendel and others. Without war, the mass of useless, incompetent mankind, without training or intelligence, is permitted to grow and expand unchecked. War acted to reduce their numbers, like storms and earthquakes and droughts. It was nature's way of eliminating the unfit. Without war, the lower elements of mankind have increased all out of proportion. They threaten the educated few, those with scientific knowledge and training, the ones equipped to direct society. They have no regard for science or for a scientific society based on reason. And this movement seeks to aid and abet them. Only when scientists are in full control can the—" He looked at his watch and then kicked the car door open. "I'll tell you the rest as we walk." They crossed the dark roof. "Doubtless you now know whom those bones belong to, who it is that we are after. He has been dead just 2 centuries now, this ignorant man from the Middle West, this founder. The tragedy is that the authorities of the time acted too slowly. They allowed him to speak, to get his message across. He was allowed to preach, to start his cult. And once such a thing is under way, there's no stopping it. But what if he had died before he preached? What if none of his doctrines had ever been spoken? It took only a moment for him to utter them, that we know. They say he spoke just once, just one time. Then the authorities came, taking him away. He offered no resistance. The incident was small." The speaker turned to Conger. "Small, but we're reaping the consequences of it today." They went inside the building. Inside, the soldiers had already laid out the skeleton on a table. The soldiers stood around it, their young faces intense. Conger went over to the table, pushing past them. He bent down, staring at the bones. "So these are his remains," he murmured. "The founder. The church has hidden them for 2 centuries?" "Quite so," the speaker said. "But now we have them. Come along down the hall." They went across the room to a door. The speaker pushed it open. Technicians looked up. Conger saw machinery whirring and turning, benches and retorts. In the center of the room was a gleaming crystal cage. The speaker handed a Slem gun to Conger. "The important thing to remember is that the skull must be saved and brought back, for comparison and proof. Aim low, at the chest." Conger weighed the gun in his hands. "It feels good," he said. "I know this gun. That is, I've seen them before, but I've never used one." The speaker nodded. "You will be instructed on the use of the gun and the operation of the cage. You will be given all data we have on the time and location. The exact spot was a place called Hudson's Field, about 1960, in a small community outside Denver, Colorado. And don't forget, the only means of identification you will have will be the skull. There are visible characteristics of the front teeth, especially the left incisor." Conger listened absently. He was watching 2 men in white carefully wrapping the skull in a plastic bag. They tied it and carried it into the crystal cage. "And if I should make a mistake?" "Pick the wrong man? Then find the right one. Don't come back until you succeed in reaching this founder. And you can't wait for him to start speaking. That's what we must avoid. You must act in advance. Take chances. Shoot as soon as you think you've found him. He'll be someone unusual, probably a stranger in the area. Apparently he wasn't known." Conger listened dimly. "Do you think you have it all now?" the speaker asked. "Yes, I think so." Conger entered the crystal cage and sat down, placing his hands on the wheel. "Good luck," the speaker said. "We'll be awaiting the outcome. There's some philosophical doubt as to whether one can alter the past. This should answer the question once and for all." Conger fingered the controls of the cage. "By the way," the speaker said, "don't try to use this cage for purposes not anticipated in your job. We have a constant trace on it. If we want it back, we can get it back." "Good luck." Conger said nothing. The cage was sealed. He raised his finger and touched the wheel control. He turned the wheel carefully. He was still staring at the plastic bag when the room outside vanished. For a long time there was nothing at all, nothing beyond the crystal mesh of the cage. Thoughts rushed through Conger's mind, helter-skelter. How would he know the man? How could he be certain in advance? What had he looked like? What was his name? How had he acted before he spoke? Would he be an ordinary person or some strange, outlandish crank? Conger picked up the Slem gun and held it against his cheek. The metal of the gun was cool and smooth. He practiced moving the sight. It was a beautiful gun, the kind of gun he could fall in love with. If he had owned such a gun in the Martian desert, on the long nights when he had lain cramped and numbed with cold, waiting for things that moved through the darkness. He put the gun down and adjusted the meter reading of the cage. The spiraling mist was beginning to condense and settle. All at once forms wavered and fluttered around him. Colors, sounds, movements filtered through the crystal wire. He clamped the controls off and stood up. He was on a ridge overlooking a small town. It was high noon. The air was crisp and bright. A few automobiles moved along a road. Off in the distance were some level fields. Conger went to the door and stepped outside. He sniffed the air. Then he went back into the cage. He stood before the mirror over the shelf, examining his features. He had trimmed his beard. They had not got him to cut it off. And his hair was neat. He was dressed in the clothing of the middle 20th century, the odd collar and coat, the shoes of animal hide. In his pocket was money of the times. That was important. Nothing more was needed. Nothing except his ability, his special cunning, but he had never used it in such a way before. He walked down the road toward the town. The first things he noticed were the newspapers on the stands. April 5th, 1961. He was not too far off. He looked around him. There was a filling station, a garage, some taverns, and a 10-cent store. Down the street was a grocery store and some public buildings. A few minutes later he mounted the stairs of the little public library and passed through the doors into the warm interior. The librarian looked up, smiling. "Good afternoon," she said. He smiled, not speaking because his words would not be correct, accented and strange probably. He went over to a table and sat down by a heap of magazines. For a moment he glanced through them. Then he was on his feet again. He crossed the room to a wide rack against the wall. His heart began to beat heavily. Newspapers, weeks on end. He took a roll of them over to the table and began to scan them quickly. The print was odd, the letters strange. Some of the words were unfamiliar. He set the papers aside and searched farther. At last he found what he wanted. He carried the Cherrywood Gazette to the table and opened it to the first page. He found what he wanted. Prisoner hangs self. An unidentified man held by the county sheriff's office for suspicion of criminal syndicalism was found dead this morning by... He finished the item. It was vague, uninforming. He needed more. He carried the Gazette back to the racks and then, after a moment's hesitation, approached the librarian. "More?" he asked. "More papers? Old ones?" She frowned. "How old? Which papers?" "Months old, and before." "Of the Gazette? This is all we have. What did you want? What are you looking for? Maybe I can help you." He was silent. "You might find older issues at the Gazette office," the woman said, taking off her glasses. "Why don't you try there? But if you'd tell me, maybe I could help you." He went out. The Gazette office was down a side street. The sidewalk was broken and cracked. He went inside. A heater glowed in the corner of the small office. A heavy-set man stood up and came slowly over to the counter. "What did you want, mister?" he said. "Old papers. A month or more." "To buy? You want to buy them?" "Yes." He held out some of the money he had. The man stared. "Sure," he said. "Sure. Wait a minute." He went quickly out of the room. When he came back he was staggering under the weight of his armload, his face red. "Here are some," he grunted. "Took what I could find. Covers the whole year. And if you want more..." Conger carried the papers outside. He sat down by the